As the adventurers step cautiously into a narrow tunnel, the flickering light from their torches casts long, dancing shadows against the damp, moss-covered walls. The air is thick with the musty scent of earth and decay, and the soft, distant sound of dripping water echoes through the passage. Their footsteps are muffled by the dirt and loose stones underfoot, but a faint rustling ahead causes the party to halt. Eyes narrow and hands tighten around weapons as they peer into the gloom. Shapes move just beyond the edge of their torchlight, shifting and whispering in an unfamiliar language that is hard to make out. The figures are hunched and small, but their features are obscured by the darkness. The tension thickens as the adventurers exchange wary glances, their senses heightened and ready for whatever might emerge from the shadows. And what does emerge? Goblins? Orcs? Gnolls? It'd be hard to blame any player from leaping to any of these conclusions. But what about kobolds? It can be hard to distinguish what makes each of these groups feel unique, and that is especially true for kobolds. If I ask you what the core fantasy of a kobold is, you would likely produce a small, cowardly lizard guy that is not that bright. But this is a disservice to the kobold, who have been a victim of their fantasy getting a little bit lost over the years. The kobold has an identity crisis, one that stems from their real-life origins. Real-life origins that begin a long, long time ago in the heart of a far, far flung-off land. Kobolds have a rich fairy tale history in Germany. In the 12th century, kobold began appearing in texts and meant the one who rules the room. Kobolds appeared as the spirit of the home and began supplanting other names that might refer to spirit or dwarf. The general idea of a kobold was one of a small sprite-like being that occupied the house, being helpful and jovial. There was a saying, laugh like a kobold, and as Grimm pointed out, the kobold has similarities to the court fool. Indeed, the kobold was also considered mischievous and may play pranks as much as they help maintain the household. In today's Western English-speaking culture, you might blame the kobold for the lost sock or the misplaced phone, instead of the fairy or the elf. While this general depiction of kobolds remains consistent, ideas about kobolds became regionalized and varied as the word was generalized to mean any helpful and mischievous spirit. While the spirits of homes and barns were referred to as kobolds, several types of spirits could be called kobolds. Kobolds also frequently appeared as malicious stone throwers that occupied underground caverns and mines, but could also lead miners to rich veins. While the term kobold could be applied to a variety of creatures, we can see this is the version of a kobold that D&D draws inspiration from, and yet the kobold struggled to be distinct from the very beginning of the hobby. Gary Gygax's 1977 Monster Manual included many mentions of the kobolds, but nothing to make them distinct from goblinoids. It is even mentioned that goblins and kobolds may be distant relatives. Gygax noted kobolds live in tribal societies and hate most other life, delighting in killing and torture. The kobold, goblin, and even the orc had nearly identical defining features. The kobold served simply as an even weaker version of a goblin, and did not even get the nod of being good miners. Heck, even the physicality of the kobold was confused. Gygax depicted kobolds with sharp teeth, horns, and pointed ears that are reminiscent of real-world depictions of demons. They also had scales and bony spines, reminiscent of lizards. Their snout, however, was long and featured a prominent nose, reminiscent of a dog, which is widely believed to have set the stage for the variety of depictions of kobolds we get around this age. As D&D turned to 2nd edition, the Monstrous Manual's entry on kobolds depicts them now as good miners, but cowardly and sadistic, with a much more rat-like motif. They are also now mentioned as purveyors of tricky tactics and overwhelming enemies with numbers, better shaping their niche. However, it would not be until 2003's Monster Manual for 3.5 that kobold's design would be solidified as mostly lizard-like, not any way confused with a rat or a puppy. The description of kobolds as cowardly and their sadistic disdain for life remain, as well as their preference for attacking with numbers, traps, and trickery. The kobold as a playable character was introduced here, though nothing else is new. 3 years later, Races of the Dragon would change the kobold's origin and place in the worlds of Dungeons & Dragons by making them dragonkin. Kobolds would now be related to dragons and possess some of the mighty dragon's natural talent for sorcery, longevity, and cunning, though in a much more diminutive package. This supplement also gave the kobold some personality, such as a love of ornamentation and a culture of putting the whole above the individual. Kobolds were described as an almost zen-like pragmatism in their shortcomings with quiet confidence in their draconic heritage. Fast forward to today, in 5e the kobold is much more draconic looking, but the depiction of kobolds in Races of the Dragon is essentially the lore we live with today, at the cusp of the next iteration of 5e. It is unfortunate that much of what is written in official sources to give kobolds an identity is largely left in the book from 18 years ago. So you cannot blame anybody for not getting excited about kobolds, nor understanding what makes them unique. Our first introduction to 5e, Hoard of the Dragon Queen, saw kobolds as cannon fodder, and nowhere in 5e are kobolds written with rich personality. So what can you do in your game to make kobolds feel like kobolds? Let's address some practical issues of play here. Let us start with the most apparent and front-facing feature of any creature in this wonderful game, fighting it. The kobold is small, weak, and numerous, much like a goblin, and that is the trap with them. See, the combat style of goblins and kobolds does include overwhelming numbers and a modicum of stealth. That is where the similarities end. A goblin encounter might include a loose assortment of fighters in large numbers that ambush the party and try their hardest to deal as much damage to the adventurers as possible before scattering when the tide turns. When the kobold ambushes the party, they work together and assist each other in attacks. Kobolds should be bequeathed some bonus or advantage to working together. When designing a kobold encounter, it would be beneficial to group your kobolds by tactic. They will tend to stick close and assist each other in attacks and covering each other's back. When the tide turns against the kobolds, they will retreat in an ordered fashion, helping one another, and perhaps sacrificing themselves so more of their comrades can get away. The kobolds retreat in such a way as to lure the party into the next ambush or the next trap. Yes, do not forget the traps. Kobolds could very easily fall off in power and not be able to challenge the party, but a clever application of traps can be the ultimate equalizer. You can implement traditional traps that go off and do a thing where the party has a chance to interact with it in some way, like spotting a pit trap or tripwire ahead. In fact, you should utilize these things in an exploration phase to really nail home the theming. However, do not forget to utilize traps to set up the next encounter. For example, you can use a pit trap to isolate a party member, or use a portcullis slamming down in the middle of a dungeon to split the party in two. Spring an ambush on a split party or an isolated member. Additionally, a judicious use of traps in the middle of combat is peak kobold. A bunch of kobold slingers on the other side of a pit trap might make it quite a surprise to your party's barbarian when they charge in. And a false wall to get a group of kobolds up in the face of your party's casters. Traps can always make for exciting and interesting changes to the current condition of the combat. In that same vein, be sure to use the environment to your advantage. Kobolds will make full use of falling rocks in elevated positions, anything they can use to give them an advantage. Kobolds will also almost never seek confrontation from their home turf, and are perfectly fine living their lives under the nose of society, or away from it. Kobolds that fall under the sway of evil would be best utilized defending an area, such as a castle, dungeon, caves, or ruins. Make sure your party has a compelling reason to engage the kobolds on the kobolds' terms. Also, keep in mind that kobolds inhabit a variety of styles. Perhaps you would like your kobolds to inhabit that much more dog-like depiction of yore. Dogs are clever and loyal pack animals, already similar to the draconic-like kobolds. This could just be a reskin for your world, or you can lean into the endearing, happy, and silly nature of our dog companions. I certainly like to give my kobolds dog-like happiness and silliness when my players interact with them. This may even help lull your players into underestimating the kobolds to their own detriment. Just try not to let this undermine their combat ability once initiative is rolled. Great, so we have a couple ideas how to use kobolds. Now let's talk about some common pitfalls. The first I see quite a bit is an over-reliance on stealth and hit-and-run tactics. The kobold does utilize deception. Traps and ambushes are not especially useful when they are easily noticed, but the sneaky creature that strikes and then nimbly escapes is the domain of the goblin, not the kobold. In other words, goblins are very roguelike, but kobolds should not necessarily be. Another common pitfall is overwhelming with numbers. A DM should be careful with using the kobolds in large numbers for a few reasons. The first is we already have goblins and undead whose identity is tied to numbers. You can use a lot of kobolds in combat, but it should not be the defining feature of a combat like a horde of zombies or goblins. The second reason is the cognitive overhead of properly utilizing kobolds. This can overwhelm a DM running a whole bunch of them, and reduce the effectiveness of the combat and themes. This extends to the fact that you should be using kobolds in more complex ways than goblins and undead. Creatures that work as a team need to be used more mindfully than the charging zombie horde that overwhelms. Additionally, creatures that work together and synergize well are usually stronger than the sum of their parts, making the encounter more difficult than what you might expect. You can try to impress upon your players the numbers of kobolds, but be careful with it. And the last common pitfall I see, kobolds are often depicted as cowards. And I just must ask, why? Is it because they are small? Because they use traps and attack in numbers? I would argue the kobolds do those things because they are clever. Yet the idea of kobolds being scared little guys is persistent. Like I mentioned earlier, kobolds are a collectivist society, and a kobold has no problem sacrificing themselves for the greater good. They value their lives no more or less than any other humanoid, and will retreat if they can. They simply value their lives less than the greater good of their fellow kobolds. Additionally, while kobolds are well aware of their limitations, they are proud of their draconic heritage, and this pride should shine through. These three things, these common pitfalls, are what I call the goblin reskin. I have seen so many supplements and DMs have their kobolds be goblins by another name. So just remember what makes a kobold in a few words: cleverness, traps, and working together. In a few more words, kobolds are proud, organized, and collectivist people that are greater than the sum of their parts. Oh yeah, also remove sunlight sensitivity, because what's the point of it? It doesn't reinforce the fantasy of a kobold. Thanks, bye!